17. Time, created being, and space. 1. The heart of Western teaching about creation derives from Augustine. To him we owe the great insight that for God to have creatures is first and foremost to take time for them. And as Augustine probed that insight, he created an interpretation of time itself, and so of created being, that has been for both good and ill a chief determinant of all Western theology, as indeed of Western thought generally. Our next step must be critique but also reappropriation of the 11th book of Augustine's Confessions. Augustine rightly drew his interpretation of time from his doctrine of God. Unhappily, his recurrent conceptual Unitarianism manifests itself with special force just here. God is understood as sheer simultaneous presence. Augustine begins his discussion with the invocation, "You, God, are eternity." When he then comes to define eternity, it is as a single moment that is always the present. In this book of the Confessions, Augustine's undifferentiated concept of static divine simplicity determines many analytic moves, as it often does when he juxtaposes God and time directly. If God is being, the being of God determines what it means also for temporal things to be. If then God is simple presence, future things and past things cannot have being as past or future but only as they are somehow present. So the decisive proposition of Augustine's interpretation of time, it is not entirely appropriate to say, there are past, present, and future. It would be better to say, there are the presence of past things, the presence of present things, and the presence of future things. Past or future things, according to Augustine, have no being as they are past or future, but only insofar as they are somehow present. This is not problematic relatively to Augustine's divine presence, for whom everything is anyway there at once. But the question here is about time as itself creation, that is, about the past and future of creatures for themselves, whose present is not infinitely encompassing. Moreover, the non-being for creatures of past and future as past and future may even, on Augustine's principles, imply the non-being for them also of the present. Augustine laid it down, if the present remained always the present and did not pass into being past, it would not be time but eternity. But just so he had immediately to ask, if the present, in order that there be time, must pass into the past, how can it be said to be at all? Here is the point of the most notorious, if perhaps somewhat playfully proposed, argument of Book 11. It seems there can be a finite present only as an instantaneous transition from future to past, and so as a purely geometrical point between them, which then must itself be temporally null. Thus throughout his discussion Augustine is pressed to the verge of answering what is time, with a flatly Neoplatonic nothingness. Yet as a reader of the Bible he cannot accept this outcome. He finds his solution in the ontology of a particular creature, the human soul, since the soul is a finite image of the infinite presence, past and future things must, somehow, be presently there for it. But they cannot be present for it in the same way as for God. What has being is, to repeat, the presence of past things, the presence of present things, and the presence of future things. This works out differently for infinite and finite consciousness, while for God it means that things are present to him in their proper entity, for us it must initially mean simply that there are neither future things nor past things. Past and future things, insofar as they are other than the finite soul, really are past and future for it, and so are what is no more or is nor yet. On Augustine's principles it seems this must mean that for the finite soul they simply are not. Augustine sees just one escape from this conclusion: past and future must be there for the soul as they are grasped within the soul in the soul's own essential presentness. The passage just cited continues, therefore they must be in the soul, and I can see no other place for them. The presence of past things is memory, the presence of present things is immediate apprehension, the presence of future things is expectation. The escape is that memory, immediate apprehension, and expectation are themselves, regardless of their contents, all present acts of consciousness. Thus the intrinsic temporality of creatures occurs as such only within creatures of one sort, souls made in the image of the divine presence. Augustine then adopts a corresponding category under which to bring time. It is a stretching out, distentio, of the soul's present act to make interior accommodation for past and future. As my present intention draws expected things through itself so that they become remembered things, the act itself is stretched out in memory and expectation. Created time for Augustine finally depends for its extension on a space within created images of divine presence, who would most straightforwardly reflect their archetype as temporally located but dimensionless points, but are stretched out to let them encompass past and future despite their finitude. In few products of intellect are profound insight and obvious muddle so mingled as in Augustine's doctrine of time. 2. In the subsequent history of Western thought, two general interpretations of time have then been available. One, in various adaptations, descends from Augustine: time is the inner horizon of human experience. The other is in a general way Aristotelian: time is the metric of external physical movement provided by a standard such movement. 4. Aristotle: the motion of the heavenly bodies provided the standard measure of the world's processes, just so this motion was approximated to eternity, and the heavens became mediators of divinity. Augustine demythologized the heavens by relocating time in the soul. The question is whether he did not thereby mythologize the soul. The Aristotelian understanding of time has anyway not been able to be suppressed. One reason is the internal incoherence of the Augustinian alternative. Augustine agrees with Aristotle that time is not motion as such but is rather a standard by which to measure motion. But the soul's distension cannot really provide such a metric, since the specious present of immediate apprehension can always, as Augustine himself points out, be differently marked off from past and future, so that its length is arbitrary, so that indeed its length is potentially null, while the reach of memory and expectation of course varies from instance to instance. In fact, Augustine still subliminally assumed an Aristotelian external timeline on which the soul is located and on which its extensions are measured, just as we have had to assume such a metric in order even to describe his teaching. Indeed, what Augustine seems at bottom to have assumed is the Platonic picture of the turning wheel of time with the geometric still point of eternity at its center. As a Christian, he could not be content with this picture. He cut the circle and stretched it out as a line, to model the biblical understanding of reality as history. But he continued to think of the point of eternity as equidistant from all temporal points. Many puzzles within Western discourse about time result from this oxymoronic root metaphor of a point perpendicular to a straight line yet equidistant from all points on it. Thus Western thinking regularly gives up the Augustinian interpretation of time and recurs to Aristotle, whenever the world external to the soul must be dealt with in its temporality, or even when the soul and its experience become themselves temporal objects of reflection. Yet the Aristotelian doctrine is also unsatisfying. It does not account for what is after all the experientially decisive feature of our dealing with time, unveiled for good and all by Augustine, that we find our experience antecedently and constitutively, transcendentally, shaped by it. The two interpretations regularly appear paired in their mutual inadequacy, even as unreconciled interpretations of time offered by recent cosmological physics. On the one hand, there is the time of classic relativity theory. It can account for the time we actually inhabit, in which there are irreversible causal sequences. Relations in this time can be like those between points on a line, and so be distinct from those in space, which posit more than one dimension. Real time is compatible with our transcendental experience of time. And in it the universe, by current observations and calculations, has a beginning that can be thought of as itself an event, the Big Bang, and one susceptible of, though far from requiring, such explanation as that God wills it. On the other hand, application of quantum mechanics to the first minimoment of the Big Bang might, some theorists hope, reveal there a time that has no such compatibility with the transcendental shape of our experience, or with a doctrine of initial creation. Two moments of this time, called imaginary time, are like points on a map, so that which way the arrow points depends on from which side the two moments are viewed. This time is indeed a fourth dimension indistinguishable from the other three. When we construe the beginning moment of the universe in imaginary time, we are not, or so it appears, obliged to account for it otherwise than by physical laws, if such they can here be called, that simply obtain for this same universe, since the Big Bang cannot in this construal be traced back to a first moment, to a singularity for which they do not apply. What quantum cosmology thus perhaps says, that the universe's own laws predict its existence, is what Thomas says is distinctive of God. this cosmology, should it be asserted as physically true and not merely convenient for certain calculations, and sheer assertion, it seems, is all that could ever be contemplated, would relapse to the theology of the Greeks, for whom the cosmos was divine. Whether science itself could then continue is an interesting question. One is anyway moved to ask, which time, real time or imaginary time, is the really real time? For the two are metaphysically contrary, only real time can be experienced, since real time is the condition of any possible experience. Instantly an inveterate dichotomy of metaphysical tempers presents itself, that real time is the time of the world as necessarily experience will suggest to some that it is the really real time, and the very same consideration will suggest to others that it is not. Neither temper can be satisfied by itself. When Immanuel Kant defines time as the enabling horizon of specifically personal experience, we are immediately convinced. Time is what we inwardly experience in experiencing anything at all. Yet when popular cosmological writings describe time as a sheer fact of the world outside us, a feature of its architecture, we are just as immediately convinced. Something that subsisted only for us or that could be fully assimilated into our inwardness would not be what we ineluctably mean by time. Surely our primal intuition of time is that it must possess the characters of both Augustine's time and Aristotle's time, of both real time and imaginary time. Time is precisely the horizon of experience, with both nouns demanding full weight. A resolution suggests itself that time is indeed, a la Augustine, the distension of a personal reality, and that just so it provides creatures with an external metric of created events. That is, that stretching out that makes time is an extension not of finite consciousness but of an infinite enveloping consciousness. God makes narrative room in his triune life for others than himself. This act is the act of creation, and this accommodation is created time. Thus as we live and move and have our being in him, the distension within which we do this is an order external to us, which therefore can provide a metric that is objective for us. Yet we are within the divine life as participants and so experience this metric as a determining character also of our existence as persons. Time is both the inner extension of a life, as for Augustine, and the external horizon and metric of all created events, as for Aristotle. For time is a distension in the life that is God, and just so is the enveloping given horizon of all events that are not God. It is in this matter as in others, Augustine's doctrine of divine simplicity made it impossible for him to acknowledge in God himself the complexity of the biblical God, and he compensated by contemplating that complexity, which as an ardent student of Scripture he could not avoid, in the created images of God. But the triune God is not a sheer point of presence, he is a life among persons. And therefore creation's temporality is not awkwardly related to God's eternity, and its sequentiality imposes no strain on its participation in being. We are now also able to make a choice earlier postponed. The life of God is constituted in a structure of relations, whose referents are narrative. This narrative structure is enabled by a difference between whence and whither, which one cannot finally refrain from calling past and future, and which is identical with the distinction between the Father and the Spirit. This difference is not measurable, nothing in God recedes into the past or approaches from the future. But the difference is also absolute. There are whence and whither in God that are not like right and left or up and down, that do not reverse with the point of view. Since now we find that what we know as time is located within and enabled by this structure, the last inhibition is surely removed. It indeed better suits the Gospel's God to speak of God's time and created time, taking time as an analogous concept, than to think of God as not having time and then resort to such circumlocutions as Barth's sheer duration. God takes time in his time for us. That is his act of creation. 3. God, we said, is a fugue, a conversation, a personal event. If the being of God may so be described, what is it for creatures to be? What is it to inhabit the accommodation in God that is created time? And if God is being, then the being of God must determine what it means also for temporal things to be. How does that work out? Our primary answer to the first question has already been given. In the context of creation, the specification of God's being as conversation is privileged. We must therefore say, to be, as a creature, is to be mentioned in the triune moral conversation, as something other than those who conduct it. Western intellectual history has for the most part continued the Greek tradition for which to be is meant to have form and so to appear and be seen, whether with the body's or the mind's eye. But there plainly is another possibility, that to be is to be heard of, and it is this interpretation that is demanded by the doctrine of creation. Within such an interpretation, instead of apprehending immediately encountered realities as a phenomena, things that appear, we will apprehend them as legomena, things that are spoken of. Things are as we hear of them, from third parties or themselves. And if beings are apprehended in their being itself, this is apprehended from the speech and address of God. But what then, if we make this move, is it to be as a creature, that is, as a real being that is not God? In the first volume, we adopted Thomas Aquinas's decisive maxim, a creature's difference from God, in respect of its being, is that its existence is other than its essence, that in what it is, if it is, there is no reason for it to be. We must now follow this out a bit further. In the process, we may slightly relocate Thomas's teaching. Thomas construes the dependence of creatures on the Creator as creatures' relation to a primary efficient and final cause of their being, in our less flexible modern language, to what is at once the cause of their being and the reason for their being. Thomas also accepts the Neoplatonic rule as valid without exception: every agent produces effects that are similar to itself in that respect in which it acts as agent. Therefore, when we say God is, and this tree is, our use of is cannot, according to Thomas, be simple equivocation, since God is the cause of creatures' being, that God is and that creatures are cannot be surely incomparable facts. Creatures' being must be somehow similar to God's being. Yet neither, says Thomas, can any predicate, including being, be univocally predicated of God and creatures. The difference of creator from creatures is, again, that there are in God no real distinctions between the fact that he is and what he is, or therefore between aspects of what he is. But all our language gets its purchase on its reference by exploiting just such distinctions in them. Jones, we say, is good, modeling a difference between substance and accident. Therefore, the sentence God is good lacks the sort of purchase on its subject possessed by the sentence Jones is good, and the predication made by the two sentences must be in some way equivocal. It is at this point that Thomas's famous doctrine of analogy appears. A word is used analogously, Thomas stipulates, when it is used simultaneously of differing reference but neither univocally nor merely equivocally. This properly happens when a word is used simultaneously in a primary sense and in one or more other senses that are dependent on it, so a horse may be healthy and climates, diets, teeth, and so on, be also healthy insofar as they are causes, symptoms, and so on, of the horse's health. God is primary efficient and final cause of creatures. A word like good must therefore be capable of simultaneous use of God and creatures, and now we can say that this use is analogous. Its meaning with primary reference to God is then first archetypical causation of what in creatures we call goodness, and with dependent reference to creatures is the experienced created quality as such. All predicates properly used at once about God and creatures are, according to Thomas, analogous in this way. Therefore, being used simultaneously of God and creatures must, as we use it, mean in the case of God first archetypical causation of created being and in the case of creatures just being. With most words used simultaneously of God and creatures, the account just given suffices. Moreover, if we use such words of creatures without simultaneous reference to God, they may or may not be used analogously. But being is used only within metaphysical discourse, of which the difference between creator and creature is in Christian theology the first axiom. Therefore being is used only analogously. Which is to say that being itself must be such as to compel analogous use of language when evoking it, that God is and this creature is are irreducibly at once incomparable and comparable facts. So far Thomas's doctrine of analogy. What we must now note is that Thomas's discourse in this context is, despite great originality over against the inherited metaphysical tradition otherwise, still firmly situated within the apprehension of being as shape that appears. The comparability of God's being and creatures' being is a similitude, a resemblance of archetype to ectype. It is that all created things are images, emphasis added, of their first cause. And the incomparability of God's being and creatures' being, as of God's goodness and our goodness, and so on, is an imperfection of this imaging. But if God's creating word is an actual utterance and not an unspoken mental form actualized by will, the matter cannot be construed quite in this way. Creatures have being precisely as God transitively says, "Let there be." Therefore, whatever God himself means by be is exactly what it means for a creature to be. Indeed, the utterance "let there be" is itself the positive relation of creature to creator, is itself the comparability of the fact that God is and that others than God are. Therefore, insofar as being says something about God or creatures, being must after all be univocal rather than analogous. And yet there must be some break between God is and creatures are. The force of Thomas's insight remains. Perhaps we may adopt categories from J.L. Austin and suggest X is univocal in its locutionary sense, in what it says about X, but equivocal in its illocutionary force, in what is done when it is said. Just so the utterance is indeed constituted in a kind of analogicity, which may indeed be finally much like that posited by Thomas. An utterance's illocutionary force is the particular act performed when it is said, and there are many sorts of such acts. We may ask, when we say God is, what do we do? And we should answer, we acknowledge our entire dependence on a primary cause and reason of our being. But we may also ask, when God says, God is, what does he do? And then we must answer, in the infinite perichoresis of the triune life, he declares himself both as the one who is sufficient reason for his own being and as the one who has that reason. Or again, when we say, creatures are, we give thanks, but when God says, creatures are, he creates. It is such propositions that state the incomparability between the fact that God is and the fact that we are. But now it is time and perhaps past time to end this train of thought. We have again fallen into using God without explicit Trinitarian unpacking. We must ask what a creature is as it answers to each of the divine persons in the creating discourse. 4. It is by virtue of the Father's particular triune role that the creating command is "let there be." Insofar as creatures are initiated by the role of the Father, their being is their mere existence, on which we then must here focus as narrowly as possible. We must interpret creaturely being as it answers to the simple occurrence of the triune being, and that is, in the concluding language of the previous volume, to the fact of the triune fugue. We must therefore here abstract from the semantics of the divine conversation and so think only of its sheer musicality. To be a creature in specific relation to the Father is to be a motif in the orchestration that occurs when God's musicality opens ad extra. We might say, the Father hums a music of the spheres, the tune of the creating triune conversation, and precisely so and not otherwise there are the spheres. Nor is it merely that there are creatures who are then harmonious with each other. To be a creature is to belong to the counterpoint and harmony of the triune music. The previous paragraph is likely to be read as metaphor, and indeed as metaphor run wild. It is not so intended, or not in any sense of metaphor that is alternative to concept. Such words as harmony are here conscripted to be metaphysically descriptive language more malleable to the gospel's grasp of reality than is, for central contrary example, the language of substance in its native Aristotelian or Cartesian or Lockean senses. That we are used to the metaphysical concepts of Mediterranean pagan antiquity and its Enlightenment recrudescence does not mean they are the only ones possible. There is no a priori reason why, for example, substance, which after all simply meant what holds something up, should be apt for conscription into metaphysical service and, for example, tune should not. We may again follow the lead of Jonathan Edwards. Living at the height of the Enlightenment, he found in Newtonian and Lockean science a grand vision of universal dynamic harmony, in itself perfectly correlate to the harmony that is the very being of the triune God. But to appropriate Newton's vision in this fashion, he had to undo the metaphysics with which the usual Enlightenment identified it. His target was a mechanism, the notion that bodies act upon each other as if they were agents, as this notion provided the vulgar Enlightenment's general picture of reality. A universe that was significantly like a great machine would not have the sort of dynamic order that answers to the harmonious life of the triune God, and indeed Edwards clearly saw that Christianity could not long coexist with a mechanist worldview. Nor did he think Christianity needed to, since mechanism was, he judged, a mere conceptual blunder, an anachronism that resulted from reading the antique conceptuality of substance onto terms in the formulas of modern science. Unthinkingly applied to the terms of scientific propositions, the old notion of substance had become the Cartesian or Lockean something that was supposed to exercise the characters that we experience in a body or that science for experienced reason attributes to it. Edwards applied Occam's razor. He excised this godlet as the moot but nevertheless conceptually disordering unneeded posit that it is. When we, for example, touch something solid, there is no need to posit an X that causes this experience. Rather, body and solidity are the same. With respect to the proceedings of everyday experience and science, the supposition that the world is composed of matter substances is merely empty. The case is the same if we suppose this or if we do not. But for religion and civil society, the mechanistic supposition must be actively deleterious. Edwards's position, he insisted, does not deny that things are where they seem to be, or the science of the causes or reasons of corporeal changes. Whatever meaning words like body or matter or motion have in the Newtonian laws themselves is exactly what he wants these words to be taken to mean. And on causation he shares the position of David Hume: a cause is any event that appears in the protasis of a true proposition of the form if it happens, then will happen. A cause does not make its effect happen, nor need there be any other occult connection between them. Gravity, for central example, is not an agency operating mysteriously at a distance, it is simply an instance of the regularity of reciprocal motion and resistance that is the reality of body. Edwards can even say, the essence of bodies is gravity. Edwards's interpretation of our knowledge of the world was thus phenomenalist and operationalist. But unlike many others who have held such positions, he had an answer to the question, is there then nothing to the play of phenomena? There is, he said, and it is God himself, in the immediate exercise of his power. The play of phenomena is the play of the mandating thoughts of God, their law-like coherence is the coherence of that thinking. At his most youthfully speculative, Edwards could identify space, the field of physical phenomena, with the field of God's consciousness. God thinks movements and resistances in universally mutual harmony, and that is the substance of the physical world, if, as Edwards says, we must needs use that word. Just so, the world described by Newton's physics and Locke's Newtonian psychology is a finite harmony appropriate to the infinite triune harmony that is God himself. Some of Edwards's propositions are dangerous as they stand in his text, to say that God himself, in the immediate exercise of his power, is the creature's sole support and coherence. Were we to take the proposition without Trinitarian differentiation, would surely threaten the distinct reality of creation. But if we take God in such references of the Father specifically, then everything we have so far said about creation must move us to affirm his speculations, as one triune aspect of the truth about creatures. Edwards has in any case cleared the way for the assertion first to be made, as the harmony of the divine consciousness is finally musical, so the harmony of creation, surely as such, is musical. And since the very being of creation is this harmony, to be a creature is, in this respect, to be harmonized, to fit in an endlessly complicated web of mutually appropriate relations, which is of course increasingly the vision of the sciences, insofar as their practitioners allow themselves to see it. 5. What, a second time, is it to be a creature? It is in virtue of the Spirit's triune role that the creating command is "let there be," that it is a liberating word. Insofar as creatures occur by the Spirit's triune agency, their being is therefore their contingency, on which we must again focus as narrowly as possible. That is, we must here interpret creaturely being as it answers merely to the freedom of the divine decision in which it is enveloped. We may say, to be a creature is, in this respect, to be freed. The modern impediment to this insight is again, of course, the usual Enlightenment's mechanism, now to be considered in this other connection. Every medium of what in the modern world everyone knows installs it in our minds that according to science all events could in principle be predicted using the laws of nature. Even most scientists, who know better in their practice, continue to Assume in everyday metaphysics that someone who knew all physical laws and the total state of the universe at some moment could predict all future events. The creation, we are taught unthinkingly to suppose, is a realm in which determinism rules. If we then nevertheless take our own experience of freedom seriously, we are forced to interpret that experience as an intrusion into the created order by another order, which is necessarily then an order of uncreated reality. It is this seeming necessity that lies behind the renewed blurring of the line between the creator and created personhood in so much 19th century theology. And yet the initial supposition is a mere prejudice. Why not instead take our indubitable experience of freedom as a conclusive refutation of mechanism? A beautiful passage in Augustine's City of God can point our way. Cicero, wrote Augustine, a great and learned man, who had pondered human life much and acutely, thought he had to choose between affirming human freedom and affirming divine foreknowledge, and in love for humanity chose the former, thereby blaspheming God. But Christians have a better understanding of the dynamics of events, so that holding to God's foreknowledge does not compel us to abandon freedom of the will, nor holding to freedom of the will compel us to deny that God knows what is to come. For the only efficient causes of events are willing causes, that is, causes in this respect like the spirit of life. According to Augustine, the freedom by which we as persons participate in the divine life is the very spirit that evokes all life, all the dynamic processes of creation. It is of course around the possibility of miracle, and so of the resurrection, and of prayer that Christian concern for creation's freedom circles. If we affirm miracles and petitionary prayer, there are two ways of accounting for them. We may assume the deterministic character of natural process and account for prayer and miracles by describing limitations of natural law and locating God's freedom in the gaps between these boundaries. Or we may take the reality of prayer and miracles as itself a metaphysical axiom. We may construct a believing interpretation of natural events that is from the start and in its entirety an interpretation by the triune role of the Spirit who is freedom. In Scripture it is true of all creatures, when you take away their breath, they die. When you send forth your Spirit, they are created. The universe or a galaxy or a quark or the reader of this text all occur in that they are enabled by the freedom that God is for himself and then for others. In Scripture, all the dynamics of the created world, the events in which it constantly becomes what it was not yet, are understood to represent the creative actuality of the Spirit. It is precisely these dynamics that mechanism conceives deterministically. Even abstracting from theological insight, the conception is certainly false. It is now well understood that the carriers of change within dynamic systems are events that individually can only be conceived either as spontaneous or as random. Thus, for example, when there is a 20% probability of snow, no one can say whether reality will fill the long odds, nor is this a limitation of our knowledge, for improvements in meteorology will only improve determination of the odds. Of the multitude of possible outcomes from the irradiating and agitating of Earth's prebiotic soup, each outcome with its own infinitesimal probability, one was the appearance of protein nucleotides. And not the most completely informed maker of predictions could then have known more than the possibility and colossal improbability of the event. The mechanics of survival described by Darwinism evidently do sometimes filter some mutations that in fact appear, but no law-like principle dictates those appearances. If there were not God, or if there were some monadic God, we would just have been describing the randomness of created events. Since there is the Spirit as one of the Trinity, we have been describing the spontaneity of created events. The difference between regarding the dynamics of the world process as random and regarding them as spontaneous may not be significant for empirical research, but it is decisive for our life as creatures in creation. If the dynamics of creation are a spontaneity, then events happen not mechanically but voluntarily, just as Augustine said. If this spontaneity is opened by the Spirit, then when we confront any actual or possible event, we confront someone's freedom. And believers claim to know that someone. Nor do we thereby invoke a God in the gaps. We have not located the liberating agency of Christ's Spirit in regions supposedly not covered by scientific description. What is attributed to the Spirit is a universal feature of the world precisely as scientifically described. Therefore prayer, to come to the religious point, is simply the reasonable thing to do. For the process of the world is enveloped in and determined by a freedom that can be addressed. What is around us is not an impersonal fate but an omnipotent conversation that is open to us. We can meaningfully and sensibly say, please let it rain, because rain will or will not happen in a spontaneity with whom we can and may discuss or even argue the matter. And we can make such addresses in hope and trust, for it is the crucified and risen Jesus whose spirit is this freedom of all events. Through the modern period, such robustly petitionary prayer has declined in the Church. This is the result not of enlightenment but of superstition. The decline rests in part on a notion of God that makes it seem absurd to tell God what He already knows about our needs, or to expect such telling to alter determination supposedly made in changeless impassibility. The whole first volume of this book labored to overcome this doctrine. Insofar as the decline rests also on the vulgar Enlightenment's deterministic misunderstanding of natural process, we can be free also from this hindrance. Precisely the scientifically accountable actual course of events can and so must theologically be understood as a history occurring within God's freedom. As for miracles, the true problem is therefore not whether they are possible, but how we are to distinguish them from events in general. We may cite a founding thinker of modern Catholicism, Maurice Blondel. Each phenomenon is a particular case and a unique solution. There is, no doubt, nothing more in the miracle than in the least of ordinary facts. But also there is nothing less in the most ordinary fact than in the miracle. That we are shocked into seeing this is the very intent of the miracle. Thomas Aquinas laid it down, if we speak with reference to God and His power, there are no miracles. What we may at this point recognize is that all actual events in their spontaneity are done immediately by God, only in harmony and proportion, the harmony given by their envelopment in God's own harmonious life. As so often in the present complex of thought, Jonathan Edwards has the decisive insight. The ordering of all events is their coherence by logical and musical appropriateness within God's thinking of them. Events lying outside the more usually expected order of events differ only as they are done in the most general proportion, not tied to any particular proportion, to this or that created being, but the proportion is with the whole series of God's acts and designs from eternity to eternity. Or in a contemporary statement, miracles are occasions when normal physical regularities are modified by a more overt influence of the underlying basis of all beings. This modification will show finite things in their true relation to their infinite ground. It will not be an arbitrary breaking of rational and self-contained laws. Thus miracles have their own internal rationality, which can probably only be perceived by us when the totality of the cosmic process is completed. The events we call miracles are as ordered as any others. To see that order we must only look to their place within the whole of God's history with us, rather than to any smaller or abstracted part of it. For it is the final truth here to be grasped, the stories told by, for example, cosmological physics or evolutionary narrative, or by such a proposition as water always runs downhill, or by a history of England or a religious history of humankind, are not other stories than the story of salvation, or even its fixed presuppositions, but rather are each merely one or another abstracted aspect of it. If miracles can be regarded as events that violate some rule, this is only by reference to such a subordinate partial ordering of events. From all of which it does not, of course, follow that purported miracles have in fact occurred. 6. What, a third time, is it to be a creature? It is in virtue of the Son's triune role that the creating command is a word with definite content. Therefore, insofar as creatures are determined by the Son's role in the triune conversation, their being is their material determination by the moral will of God, on which again we must now focus as narrowly as possible. That is, we must interpret creaturely being strictly as it answers to what is morally said in the divine conversation that mandates it. We will then say, to be a creature is, in Christological respect, to be a revelation of God's will. In the more dramatic and therefore more accurate language we found in Luther, to be a creature is to be a created word from God. We will not here proceed as we did in the previous 2 sections. The question of God's revelation in creation and of our knowledge of God from creation has historically acquired such importance and complication as to require its own chapter. The way in. Which creatures are words that speak for God must be the foundation of that chapter, and its discussion will appear there. Here we will take up only one, perhaps initially surprising, aspect of the matter. We saw that as the specific personal history that Jesus the Son is, as the moral content of the divine conversation, the Son mediates the Father's originating and the Spirit's liberating with one another. That is, he is the specious present of the divine life. But the horizon of presence, of what is present to us at any time, is what we call space. Thus we earlier said that the Son holds open the space for creatures to be. As we began with time, we end with space. For God to create, we said, is for him to take time for us. But it must surely also be said that for God to create is for him to make space for us. Perhaps merely to preserve a certain symmetry of presentation, we will begin a new section for the matter. 7. In interpreting the reality of time, we could not avoid the language of space. Time, we said, is the room God makes in his eternity for others than himself. But what do we mean by speaking of room? The metaphysical tradition has tended to interpret time in terms of space, pointing to the need to use spatial language when speaking of time. But of course we also need to use temporal language to speak of space. A distant point is where we now are not but could be in the future, and so on. Christian theology must interpret the mutuality signaled by these linguistic phenomena the other way around from the inherited metaphysical tradition. Time is not what happens in space, space is the horizon of the present tense, that is, of one aspect of time, of what is all there for us at once. Augustine did not notice that not only do the presence of the future and the presence of the past in consciousness demand a distension of consciousness, but that so does presence itself. Space is the distension within which things can be now there for us. The removal of certain distinctions between time and space by relativity theory, and indeed already by the first beginnings of modern science, precisely reflects the theological fact: God does not create spatial objects that thereupon move through time, he creates temporal spatial objects. That is, in a more precise language, he creates histories. We must only avoid the suggestion of popular appropriations, which in calling time a fourth dimension tend to use dimension in a pictorial sense, thus obliterating time's distinction from space. Immanuel Kant analyzed space as the a priori experience, that is the condition of our locating objects of experience outside ourselves, that is, of distinguishing them from ourselves. Space, we may perhaps push Kant to say, is the a priori of otherness. So far as this goes, surely it corresponds to our intuition. Yet here, as with time, the intuition divides. When Kant then claims that space simply is not a determination that pertains to objects themselves, we cannot but turn and sympathize with thinkers who have wondered what can then mean by objects. What with time was the end of reflection can here be a beginning. Time, we came to see, cannot be satisfactorily interpreted except as a distension in God's life. If space is the horizon of time's present tense, it must be interpreted as a feature of that same distension. Thus if space is the form of consciousness that enables distinguishing other reality from oneself, we must say that this distinction is first made by God. God opens otherness between himself and us, and so there is present room for us. We have already argued that and why those accommodated as participants in the divine life do not thereby become persons of that life. Space, we may say, is the form of God's own experience of this otherness, which experience, of course, enables it. It is therefore not merely because of the limitations of our finitude that we inevitably imagine God as beyond or above us, using what we are likely misleadingly to call metaphors or mere pictures. It is simply the reverse of the fact that we are beyond for God. It is an ancient maxim: God is his own space. The maxim is meaningful only if God does posit an other than himself from which he is at a distance, so as himself to be a space, only, that is, if there are creatures. Since there are in fact creatures, their otherness from God establishes that God is one place, and creation is spatially located by not being at that place. God is one place and creatures another, and just and only so there is created space. We now first think of space as the extension within which creatures are distinguished from each other. Space here is experienced as an aspect of the universe's architecture, an objectively given three-variable coordinate system by which I am located at point x, y, z1, you at point x, y, z2, and so on. A dilemma appears here similar to that which characterized our intuition of time. We want space to be both an a priori of consciousness and a sort of container within which we and all our consciousnesses are to be found. The resolution has been anticipated. Space can be at once an a priori of our consciousness and a structure within which we locate ourselves, because it is an aspect of God's enveloping conscious life. Were there only one point, that is, were there no space, the universe's multiplicity and variation would be illusion. But the universe could be thus simple only if it were not finally other than the one origin, only if the emanationist possibility were actual. The great motto of the Upanishads, "You are that, where any you and any that can satisfy these variables," identifies all created beings with one another in that it identifies them all with the divine. This threat is overcome in that God sets us as other than himself, in that our accommodation in him has the present dimension of separateness. We may now recur to the Son's mediation of creation. The Father's love of the Son is, we have seen, the possibility of creation. Insofar as to be a creature is to be other than God, we may say that the Father's love of the Son as other than himself is the possibility of creation's otherness from God. And the Son's acceptance of being other than God is the condition of that possibility's actualization. Moreover, we now also see why we had to say that time was the room God made for us in his life. Did not God set us other than himself? Did he not make space between him and us? All time would just be his time and there would be no accommodation in him. And finally, we must inquire into the relation between God himself and the space he makes for us. God is his own place. What then is the relation of God, as his own place, to the space he makes in time for creatures? If he is not to be an absent, deist God, he must be present to creatures in their space. How is that? According to Thomas Aquinas, wherever something is at work, that is where it is, at least in the sense of where here appropriate. In the case of persons, Thomas unpacks this into presence, by power and presence to consciousness. And in the case of the person God, he is present with all creatures, by power in that they are subject to his rule, and is also present with all creatures in that all things are naked and open to his sight. Thomas's teaching exploits a quite straightforward analogy. There is a plain sense in which my space is the presentness spread before me as I go about any task or as I enter converse with some person or group. Space is the place then available to my agency and for the sake of that agency open to my immediate apprehension. Just in this way the creation is a place open to God, the distance he sets between him and us is our placement before him as objects of his will and knowledge. And within creation, turning back to the Damascene, that place is called God's place that more fully participates in his energy and grace. 8. Finally, we must register two facts. The one is matter, which takes up and defines space. And the other is consciousness, which takes up no space but nevertheless occurs temporally and so is located in space, in God's case as the space he is for himself. About matter, we may call on Edwards for the needed insight, for the last time in this context. With material substances eliminated, he is free to specify body as identical with solidity or resistance itself, resulting from the immediate exercise of God's power, causing there to be indefinite resistance in that place where it is. Uniform motion is then the communication of this resistance, from one part of space to another successively. An accelerated motion, gravity, is basically the same phenomenon as solidity. Thus, matter is constituted in a harmony of God's spatial ordinations, of his lively separatings of creatures from himself and each other. Any creation of the triune God, no matter how different from the actual creation, would be in some way material. That is, in it creatures would be made available to one another as other than one another, in a structure of such presentation set by God's command. We must note this particularly to prepare for the final part of this work, for also the new heaven and the new earth will be God's creatures. As for consciousness, it is so obvious that it sometimes seems to be a puzzle. But there is nothing to solve. We cannot and should not try to define or analyze consciousness, since we know it better than we know anything by which we might try to explicate it. Thus, the fact of consciousness is the same as the fact of being itself, of sheer givenness. This is the precarious and almost irresistibly misleading moment of truth in modern idealisms. To be given is necessarily to be given for a consciousness or to be that consciousness. We can perhaps alleviate some of that temptation. If being is conversation, then consciousness is the sheer fact of being. One pole of some personal communion. This is not a definition or derivation, since it is circular. Or we can say, consciousness is just a somewhat misleading label for the sheer fact of being a person, and to that fact we will shortly devote an entire chapter. Assuredly, consciousness cannot be derived from anything else, as scientific ideologues decree it must be. The formulas of biology, or chemistry or physics, cannot explain it, since it is not mentioned by any variables that appear in them. All attempts to reduce the fact of consciousness to neurological or otherwise biological or chemical events are merely logical blunders of a remarkably crude variety. From these 2 paragraphs on, we will therefore simply assume, as indeed we have already been doing, that God and we, and whatever other creatures God may designate, are consciousnesses, and that we know what we mean when we say that.